Ella Whitaker made the announcement on a Tuesday morning in the middle of the Clearwater General Store, and by noon, the whole town of Harrow Creek, Texas, had heard every word of it. She had not meant for it to carry so far. She had said it simply, plainly, without theatrics, in the way that a woman who has run out of patience says the truest thing she knows. She had been standing at the dry goods counter, waiting on a bolt of blue cotton flannel, when old Mabel Dawson had leaned close and whispered for the third time that week that Ella ought to consider settling down before she lost her looks entirely, and something in Ella's chest had simply snapped. "Any decent man who wants to marry me is welcome to ask," Ella had said, loud enough that the two ranch hands near the coffee barrel turned their heads. "I mean that. Any decent man who has an honest trade and an honest heart, I will consider his proposal seriously. I am 24 years old. I own the best seamstress shop between here and San Antonio, and I am tired of waiting for some fairy tale that has no intention of arriving." Mabel had blinked. The ranch hands had traded glances. And Ella had taken her flannel, paid her bill, and walked out with her chin up and her heart hammering, because even she had not entirely expected those words to come out of her mouth. That was the spring of 1882, and Harrow Creek was the kind of small West Texas town where a statement like that did not fade into the dust. It multiplied. By suppertime it had been dressed up with commentary, and by the following morning it had acquired several interpretations, most of them unflattering, a few of them hopeful, and at least one of them wildly wrong. The men of Harrow Creek reacted in the ways that men of that era and that place generally reacted to a direct and unexpected invitation from a capable, attractive, unbowed woman. They talked about it. They considered it from a great distance. They made jokes at the saloon. They nudged each other. And then, one by one, they found reasons why they would not be the one to actually walk through the door of Ella Whitaker's shop on Morrow Street and say the words. There was Frank Holloway, who ran the feed store and was considered a reasonable prospect, except that his mother still cut his meat for him at dinner, and everyone in town knew it. He got as far as standing on the boardwalk outside Ella's window for several minutes before walking away at high speed when she looked up from her sewing. There was Tom Beale, who was young and had a nice horse and spent 45 minutes working up to saying hello before turning red as a summer beet and retreating to the church steps to breathe into his hat. There was Deputy Clarence Potts, who was 43 and twice widowed, who thought about it very seriously, who genuinely believed he might be ready, and who then heard that Ella kept a ledger and read books in French, and decided quietly that she was out of his reach in ways he could not articulate. None of them asked. And the days went by, and the declaration began to take on an embarrassing quality, the kind of thing that a woman says and then cannot unsay, the kind of thing that hangs in the air and begins to wilt. Ella heard the whispers. She heard the versions of her own words being repeated back to her in tones that ranged from pity to mockery, and she kept her back straight and her face composed, and she went on hemming skirts and setting sleeves because there was nothing else to do. She had told the truth. That was the hardest part. She had not been performing for Mabel Dawson's benefit. She had not been grandstanding. She was genuinely, honestly, thoroughly tired of the particular loneliness that came from being a woman of means and mind and spirit in a place that did not quite know what to do with a woman like that. She wanted someone to talk to at the end of the day. She wanted someone to share a meal with and argue with and laugh with. She wanted the ordinary warmth of an ordinary life with an extraordinary person, and she was old enough to know that extraordinary people did not necessarily look extraordinary from the outside. She just had not counted on nobody asking. Martin Crawford arrived in Harrow Creek on a Thursday afternoon in early April, trailing dust and leading a spotted mule named Gus, who regarded the world with a philosophical indifference that Martin himself often envied. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered without being showy about it, with dark hair that wanted cutting and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, neither quite brown nor quite green, but something honest in between. He had ridden up from the south, from a 3-year stretch of cattle work along the Pecos River, and he had come to Harrow Creek for a specific purpose. His uncle, a man named Dale Crawford who had died the previous November, had left him a small ranch 3 miles east of town. It was not a grand legacy. The house needed a new roof, the fence line was in serious disrepair, and the well had a suspicious lean to it that suggested it was thinking about giving up. But it was land, real land, and Martin had spent long enough sleeping under other men's roofs to understand what that meant. He stabled Gus at Holloway's feed and livery, paid for a week's worth of board, and walked into town carrying his bedroll and his saddlebags, and the quiet air of a man who is looking at everything, without appearing to look at anything. He had grown up in the open country south of Abilene, and he had the particular watchfulness that came from that upbringing, the kind of attention that noticed what was real and let the rest go. He ate supper at the Harrow Creek Hotel dining room, a bowl of bean soup and cornbread that was a day past its best, and he listened to the general conversation of the place with one ear while he thought about fence posts with the other. He heard Ella Whitaker's name for the first time from the hotel's owner, a round-faced man named Bernard Wick, who mentioned it while refilling Martin's coffee cup. "Town's been talking about the seamstress woman on Morrow Street," Bernard said, in the conversational way of a man who fills silences with whatever is nearest. "Said she'd marry any decent man who asked her. Been about 10 days now. Nobody's asked." Martin looked up from his soup. "Why not?" Bernard shrugged. "She's particular, educated, runs her own business. Men here are a little afraid of her if I'm being honest about it." Martin considered this. "What's wrong with running her own business?" Bernard blinked as though the question had not occurred to him in that form. "Nothing wrong with it, I suppose. It's more the way she says things, straight out, without much softening." "That seems like a reasonable quality in a wife," Martin said. Bernard looked at him for a moment with something that might have been surprise. "You just arrived, didn't you?" Martin went back to his soup. "I did." He did not think much more about it that evening. He had a ranch to attend to, and he went to bed with plans for fence posts and roof timbers running through his mind. And Ella Whitaker was just a name he had heard once, a detail in the town's current gossip, no different from 100 other towns and their 100 other small dramas. But the next morning he needed buttons. He had discovered that the shirt he planned to wear for his meeting with the Harrow Creek Land Office had lost 2 of its buttons somewhere on the trail south of town, and he needed them replaced before he could present himself as a man who had himself together. He asked Bernard, who pointed him toward Morrow Street. "There's the Whitaker shop," Bernard said. "She does mending too, not just fancy sewing." Martin found the shop without difficulty. The sign above the door was hand-lettered with a clean, confident hand. "Whitaker Alterations and Fine Sewing." The window displayed a dress form wearing a half-finished green wool riding coat that was, by anyone's reckoning, exceptionally well made. He pushed the door open and the small bell above it rang. The inside of the shop smelled of clean fabric and beeswax, and it was orderly in the way of a space where someone worked with genuine care. There were bolts of cloth sorted by weight and color on shelves along the left wall, a long work table in the center with a good lantern above it, and at the back, behind a wooden counter, sat Ella Whitaker. She was bent over a piece of dark wool, stitching with small, precise movements, and she did not look up immediately. Martin had a moment to observe her before she raised her eyes, which he later decided was either very fortunate or very unfair, depending on how you wanted to look at it. She was not beautiful in the conventional, posed way that the word usually implied. She was better than that. She was a woman whose face had been shaped by genuine thinking, by opinions formed and held, by laughter and by a certain careful sadness that lived quietly at the corners of her eyes. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pulled up and pinned with a practicality that nevertheless left a few strands loose at her temples. She was, he gauged, somewhere around his own age, perhaps a little younger, and she wore a plain blue dress with an apron over it, and she looked entirely and completely like herself, which was the rarest thing he had ever seen in a person. She looked up. Her eyes were gray and they assessed him without pretense. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you?" "2 buttons," Martin said. "Brown if you have them to match this." He held out the shirt. She set down her work and came to the counter, and she took the shirt from him and examined the remaining buttons with a practiced eye. She did not make small talk while she did it. She simply looked at the thing she needed to look at, which he found immediately comfortable. "I have something close," she said. "Not identical, but it'll be a clean match. You'll need the whole row replaced if you want them to look right." "All right," he said. She looked at him. "That'll be a quarter." "That's fine." She studied him for one more moment, the kind of study that a person makes when they are trying to place something about a face or a manner. "You're not from here," she said, not a question. "Just arrived yesterday. I've got the Crawford ranch east of town. Dale Crawford was my uncle." Something shifted in her expression. "I heard Dale Crawford passed. I'm sorry for it. He was a good man. He used to come in for shirt mending." She said it simply, with genuine regard, and then she went back to looking at his buttons. He waited while she found a match from her collection, and he looked at the rest of the shop while he waited, and he noticed the small bookshelf behind her work area with more books on it than most people in Harrow Creek owned in their entire lives, and he noticed that she had a cup of coffee going cold on the corner of her table, and he noticed that her hands were quick and sure and unself-conscious, and he thought that Bernard Wick had been entirely wrong about this woman. There was nothing frightening about her at all. There was only something genuine, which was perhaps a different thing. "I'll have it ready by this afternoon," she said. "I appreciate it." He left and went to the land office and took care of his business and came back in the afternoon, and the shirt was done and the buttons were, as she had promised, a clean match, and he paid her and she thanked him, and he stood at her counter for a moment that ran one beat longer than the transaction required. "Miss Whitaker," he said, and then paused because he had not entirely planned what came next. She waited without impatience. "Would it be appropriate to ask you to supper?" he said. "Not as a business matter, just as a supper." The gray eyes studied him. He had the impression that she was measuring something with the same precision she applied to everything else, and he did not try to perform for that measurement. He just stood there and let her look. "Mr. Crawford," she said slowly. "Martin," he said. "Martin," she repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "I have heard that you have been in town less than 48 hours. That's accurate. And you've apparently already heard my announcement or something like it." He was quiet for a moment, deciding on honesty. "I heard your name mentioned. I'm not asking because of any announcement. I'm asking because I came back this afternoon and found I wanted to say something more than thank you for the buttons." It was a long moment, the kind that felt like weather changing. Then she nodded once. "The hotel dining room," she said. 7 o'clock, and Martin. "Yes. If you ask me to marry you, I will actually consider it." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "I'll see you at 7. He walked out and the bell above the door rang, and Ella stood at her counter for a full minute without moving, one hand resting on the edge of the wood, staring at the door. Nobody had done that. Nobody had walked in and simply asked cleanly, without performing and without running away. Nobody had heard the warning implicit in what she had told him and said yes anyway, right to her face, without flinching. She picked up her coffee cup, found it cold, and smiled at nothing in particular. The hotel dining room at 7 was half full of the usual Thursday evening traffic, ranchers and their wives and a table of traveling merchants, and Martin was already there when she arrived, which she noted, standing at the door in her second-best dress, a deep burgundy wool that she had altered herself 3 times until it was exactly right. He had found time to have his hair cut and his boots cleaned, and he stood when she walked in, which was a small thing but not a small thing at all. They sat across from each other at a table near the window, and Bernard Wick himself came to pour their water with a look on his face that suggested he found the whole situation deeply interesting, and Ella let him have his curiosity and looked at Martin Crawford instead. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, because she was not a woman who started with the weather. He told her honestly. He told her about the leaning well and the roof and the fence line, and the 3 years he had spent working cattle along the Picos, learning which decisions a man could make in haste and which ones required sleeping on them. He told her about his Uncle Dale, who had been the kind of man who fixed things with wire and prayer and somehow made it work, and who had left him the only piece of land in the family without any argument about it because Martin was the only one who had ever loved land for its own sake. She listened the way she worked, with complete attention. When he finished, she said, "How much is owed on it?" "Nothing," he said. "It's clear. Dale didn't believe in debt." "Good," she said, with the blunt satisfaction of a woman who kept her own ledger. "Neither do I. Tell me about the shop," he said. She told him. She told him about starting it 4 years ago with money she had saved from 3 years of sewing for every household in the county, and about the way the town had watched to see if she would fail, and about the 2 ranchers' wives who had given her their business first, out of charity, and how she had made them such excellent garments that charity had turned to loyalty, and how she had built the shop from the ground up with her own decisions and her own hands, and she was proud of it in a way that she had stopped apologizing for. "My mother thinks it's made me unmarriageable," she said. "She lives in Galveston. She writes me letters about it." "Your mother is wrong," Martin said. Ella looked at him. "You just met me." "I know. I still think she's wrong." The food came, roasted chicken and potatoes and stewed beans, and they ate and they talked, and the conversation moved through the evening the way good water moves through good country, finding its level and its pace without effort. They talked about books, and it turned out that Martin had read more widely than his appearance suggested, having spent 3 years of winter evenings in bunkhouses going through whatever volumes he could trade for. And they disagreed pleasantly about Walter Scott, and agreed about Mark Twain, and discovered a shared, deep fondness for the particular silence of very open country at dawn. They were the last table in the dining room when Bernard Wick began putting chairs up, and they looked at each other across the remains of their supper, and understood that the evening had gone somewhere neither of them had entirely anticipated. He walked her back to her shop, because she lived in the 2 rooms behind it, and they stood on the boardwalk outside the door in the cool April night, with the stars coming down so low over the Texas plain that it seemed like you might reach up and put your hand through one. "I meant what I said this afternoon," he told her, "about considering it." "I know," she said. "I meant what I said too, about actually thinking about it." "I'm not in a hurry," he said, and he meant that with everything that was in him. "I'm not asking tonight because we've had one supper, but I want you to know that I am the kind of man who says what he means and means what he says, and I meant every word this afternoon." She looked at him in the starlight, and she thought that she had been lied to in various comfortable and polished ways by men she had known, and that nothing about Martin Crawford was comfortable or polished, and that this felt safer than any amount of polish had ever felt. "Ask me again in a month," she said, "when we actually know each other." "All right," he said. He touched his hat and walked back toward the hotel, and Ella went inside and sat down at her work table without lighting a lamp, just sat in the dark for a few minutes listening to the town settle into the night, feeling something in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite joy, but something that preceded both of them. The next month was one of the fuller months of Ella Whitaker's life. Martin came to town every few days from the ranch, where he had begun the work of putting things right. He hired 2 men from town to help with the fence line, a Mexican cowhand named Rodrigo Salinas, and a quiet young man named Pete who had arrived in Harrow Creek without much history and was glad to work for honest pay. The 3 of them spent the first 2 weeks pulling old posts and sinking new ones, and Martin came into town when he could, dusty and straight-backed, and he always stopped at the shop. He never stayed long on the work days. He would come in to buy something he needed or to return something she had mended for him, and they would talk for 10 minutes or 20, standing at her counter or sitting in the 2 chairs she kept by the window, and the conversations were always the kind that neither of them wanted to stop, but that both of them were disciplined enough to end at a reasonable time. He was trying to rebuild a ranch. She had a business to run, but there were the evenings too. They had supper again the following week, and the week after that, and by the third time the town of Harrow Creek had categorized them as a matter of general knowledge, which meant that every third person who came into Ella's shop had an opinion about it that they were eager to share with her. Mabel Dawson came in on a Tuesday. "I hear you've been seeing the Crawford man," she said, in the tone of a woman who is gathering evidence. "I have," Ella said, not looking up from the riding coat she was finishing. "Fast," Mabel said. "He asked me to supper," Ella said. "That is not particularly fast, Mabel. He arrived and within 2 days he had you at the hotel." "He needed buttons replaced," Ella said. "And then he asked politely and I accepted politely. That is how it is supposed to work." She looked up. "Or so I have been given to understand by the number of people who told me for 4 years that I ought to get married." Mabel opened and closed her mouth. She bought a spool of white thread and left. 2 days after that, Frank Holloway came into the shop for the first time in the month since he had stood outside the window and retreated, and he was civil and uncomfortable and purchased a pair of work gloves from Ella's small dry goods section. And when he left, she understood that the town was conducting a kind of audit of Martin Crawford on her behalf, and she found that she did not particularly need their findings. She had her own findings. She knew that he had paid Rodrigo Salinas and Pete each their full weekly wages on a Friday, even when the week's work had run short because of rain, without being asked. She knew this because Pete had told her so when he came in to buy thread for his mother in San Angelo, who he wrote to every Sunday. She knew that Martin had ridden out personally to the small homestead of the Garza family 2 miles south of his property, when he heard that old Francisco Garza had broken his leg, and had spent an afternoon helping them with the things that needed doing, without anyone having asked him to do that either. She knew that he had been to the town library, a collection of donated volumes kept in the back room of the courthouse, 3 times in the month since he arrived. She knew this because she herself went every week. She knew that when he disagreed with her, which he did regularly and without apology, he disagreed with her as an equal, presenting his argument and listening to hers, and sometimes revising his position and sometimes not, but always making the exchange feel like a conversation between 2 people of equal standing. That was rarer than it should have been. She was, by the middle of April, thoroughly aware that she was in serious trouble of a very pleasant variety. He came to supper at her shop on a Wednesday evening, which was new, because she cooked this time, using the small iron stove in the back room, and she made a chicken stew with biscuits that was considerably better than the hotel dining room's output, and they ate at her small table with the lamp between them and talked until the lamp oil got low. He told her about growing up in Abilene, about his father who had been a good man made harder by failed seasons and early death, about his mother who had managed 3 boys and a difficult patch of land with a determination that had shaped Martin in ways he was still discovering. His mother was in Austin now, living with his older brother and his family, comfortable and finally rested, and he wrote to her every month. Ella told him about Galveston, about growing up near the Gulf in the humid salt air, about the hurricane of 1875 that had taken 2 houses on their street and shaken everything after it loose. Her mother was alive and her father had died of fever when Ella was 16, and the loss of him had been the kind of thing that left a particular shape in a life, an absence with edges. She had come inland to Harrow Creek with her aunt 7 years ago, and the aunt had since remarried and moved to Dallas, and Ella had simply stayed. Because of the shop. He asked. Because it became mine, she said. The town, the street, the shop, you put enough of yourself into a place and it starts to belong to you, or you start to belong to it. It's difficult to say which direction it goes. He looked at her over the lamp and she saw something in his face that was careful and serious, the face of a man who was listening to something important. "I understand that," he said quietly. "The ranch, even in a month." "Even in a month," she agreed. And then there was a silence that was the kind of silence that a fire makes when it's burning well and cleanly, a silence that is not empty but full. "Ella," he said. "Martin," she said at the same moment. They both stopped. She laughed first, a real laugh, the kind that a woman produces when she is caught off guard, and then he was laughing too, and the tension of the moment broke open into something easier and warmer, and they sat in the low light with the laughter still settling and looked at each other. "Go ahead," she said. "I was going to ask you something," he said, "but not the question, not tonight." "The month isn't done," she said. "No," he agreed. 8 days yet." 8 days, she said. He helped her wash the dishes, which nobody had ever done before in the back room of her shop, and he left at a reasonable hour, and she stood at the door and watched him walk toward the hotel and thought that there was something entirely extraordinary about the ordinary way he existed in the world. He did not perform. He did not posture. He simply was himself, consistently and without variance, and she had lived long enough to know what an uncommon thing that was. The 8 days were not uneventful. On the 5th day, there was a dispute. It had to do with the Garza family, specifically with a man named Orrin Tilby, who owned the water rights to the creek that ran between Tilby's large property and the smaller homesteads to the south, including the Garza plot and a small portion of the Crawford land. Tilby was the kind of man who had become prosperous in the way that some men became prosperous in that era, not through superior work, but through superior appetite, acquiring rights and access and favorable arrangements, while others were occupied with simply surviving. Martin had discovered, in his survey of the Crawford property, that Tilby had extended a fence line approximately 40 yards onto Crawford land, incorporating a stretch of creek access that had historically belonged to the Crawford property. Dale Crawford, in his final years, had been too tired and too sick to press the matter. Tilby had counted on that. He had not counted on Martin. Ella heard about it secondhand from Rodrigo Salinas, who came in to have a tear in his jacket mended, and who told her, with the spare accuracy of a man who chose his words carefully, that Mr. Crawford had ridden to Tilby's place that morning and informed Tilby directly that the fence would be moved back to the proper line within the week, and that Tilby had not been pleased, and that Mr. Crawford had been entirely calm about it. "Did anything happen?" she asked. Rodrigo considered. "Tilby has men who stand around him," he said. Mr. Crawford looked at them the way you would look at a situation that has a solution, not a problem that cannot be solved. He said what he came to say and he left. "The fence will move." Ella paid him for the jacket information, along with the mending, and thought about the particular quality of a man who walked into a volatile situation, and made it smaller rather than larger by refusing to be frightened by it. She went out to the ranch for the first time on the 6th day, riding the hired horse she kept an arrangement with the livery for, following the directions Martin had given her with the ease of a woman who had navigated the open Texas country on horseback since she was old enough to hold reins. The ranch house was visible from half a mile off, a solid if weather-worn structure in a bend of the creek, backed by a stand of live oaks that gave it a settled, permanent look. The new fence line was visible from the lane, straight and clean, a considerable improvement on what she could see of the old post still lying in the grass nearby. Martin came out from the barn when he heard her ride up. He was in work clothes, his sleeves rolled, and he had been doing something that involved fresh lumber, because there were shavings on his forearms. He looked surprised to see her, and then genuinely pleased, which was different from performed pleasure in a way she had learned to read. "I wanted to see it," she said simply, dismounting with the ease of practice. He walked her around, all of it, the house and the barn and the repaired well and the garden patch that had gone to weeds but was clearly plannable, and he told her what he intended and showed her what he had already done, and she could see the ranch as it was and the ranch as it was becoming at the same time, because she had the same kind of double vision about her own shop that she recognized in him, the ability to inhabit a place as it would be rather than just as it was. They sat on the porch steps in the afternoon light and drank coffee that Pete had made in the bunkhouse and shared between them, and she looked at the live oaks and the wide flat country going golden in the lowering sun, and she thought that it was going to be a beautiful place when it was done. "The Garza family," she said, "the water rights situation." "Resolved," he said. "Tilby moved the fence yesterday. Rodrigo and Pete were witnesses." "I heard," she looked at him. "You were not afraid of him." "I was practical about him," Martin said. "The law was clear. Tilby just needed someone to say it plainly." He paused. "Men like Tilby count on people being afraid." "I'm not interested in being what they're counting on." Ella looked out at the oaks. "The Garza family has had a difficult time of it," she said. "Old Francisco's leg is healing slowly. His daughter, Maria, she is good people. She brings me vegetables from their garden in summer." "I know," Martin said. "I've met Maria. She brought me cornmeal last week and explained in considerable detail how I was not tending my garden patch properly." Ella looked at him. "She was right," he said. She laughed, and he smiled, watching her laugh with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who is entirely glad to have caused something good. She rode back to town in the early evening with the spring air on her face and the feeling that she had been to a place that was going to be important to her, that she had stood in the middle of a life that was being built and recognized it the way you recognized your own handwriting. On the 7th day, a letter arrived from her mother in Galveston. It contained the usual gentle pressure, the gentle pressure of a woman who loved her daughter and was afraid for her in the particular way of mothers who have outlived one significant disaster and see disasters everywhere after it. Her mother mentioned a cousin's son in Galveston who was a banker and respectable, who was visiting Houston in the summer, who might come to Harrow Creek if Ella were interested. Ella read the letter twice and then wrote back, which she did not always do immediately. She wrote that she was well. She wrote that the shop was profitable and the lease on Morrow Street was renewed. She wrote that there was a man, a good man, a rancher who had been a cattleman and who had come into her shop for buttons, and that she believed he was going to ask her something in the next few days, and that she was going to say yes. She sealed the letter and addressed it and walked it to the post herself that afternoon. She was 30 seconds from the post office door when she nearly walked into Martin coming from the opposite direction with a package under his arm. They stopped in the afternoon street and looked at each other, and she had the letter in her hand, and he had the package under his arm, and the town of Harrow Creek moved around them the way a river moves around two rocks, and it was the 8th day. "I'm mailing a letter," she said. "I was going to come to the shop this evening," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at the letter in her hand and then at her face. "Ella," he said. "Martin," she said. "It's been a month," he said. "It's only the 8th day." "Close enough," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, and she thought that she was never going to be tired of the way his face looked when he was trying not to smile because he was in the middle of something serious. He set the package down on the bench outside the post office, which contained a bolt of calico he had been sending to his sister-in-law in Austin, and he stood in front of her on the main street of Harrow Creek, with the spring afternoon going golden all around them and the whole town, as it later seemed, holding its breath. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said directly, without preamble and without theater. "I know it's been a month. I know that's not long. But I have been paying attention for every one of those days, and I know what I know, and what I know is that I want to talk to you every day for the rest of my life, and I want to fix up that ranch with you looking at it, and I want to be the person you come home to, and I would like very much to be your husband if you'll have me." He was quiet. The afternoon moved around them. A wagon went past. Somewhere a door opened and closed. Ella stood with her letter in her hand and looked at the man who had walked into her shop for buttons and asked her to supper and helped wash her dishes and moved a fence line 40 yards because it was right, and who laughed when she laughed and who had never once, in the entire month, tried to be anything other than himself. "Yes," she said. It was the simplest word she had ever said, and it felt like setting something down that she had been carrying a long distance, and like picking something else up at the same moment that was not heavy at all. She mailed the letter, and then they walked to the hotel and ordered coffee, and they sat at the table by the window where they had eaten their first supper, and they talked about it, practically and warmly and completely, the way two people who are genuinely well matched for each other talk about a future they are both committing to with their eyes fully open. They talked about the ranch and the shop, because she was not closing the shop. That was the first thing she said, and the first thing he agreed to without hesitation. She had built it, it was hers, and she would keep it, and she would hire an assistant when the ranch required her time. But the business was not something she was folding up because she was getting married, and he looked at her as though the idea that she might had not crossed his mind. They talked about the house, which needed things that she could see and that she had opinions about, and he listened to those opinions with the specific attention of a man who understood that opinions about a house are also opinions about a life. They talked about children carefully and honestly, the way grown people talk about important things. They both wanted them. They both understood that they were not guaranteed, that life on the frontier was not gentle in that particular way, that you built toward what you hoped for and made peace with what came. It was a mature conversation and a tender one, and at the end of it, Martin reached across the table and covered her hand with his, which was the first time he had touched her hand, and it was a warm, steady, deliberate touch that felt like everything he was. They were married 6 weeks later, on a Saturday in late May, in the small white church on the corner of Aldrich and Main, in front of what turned out to be a considerable portion of Harrow Creek's population, because the town that had watched with skepticism and commentary had somehow arrived at feeling proprietary about the whole thing. Reverend James Alcott presided, a gentle-voiced man who had known Dale Crawford and who said so in the brief remarks before the vows, connecting the legacy of the man who had left Martin the ranch with the new thing being built on that land, which made Martin's jaw work briefly in a way that was the only evidence of emotion he allowed himself to show in public, and which Ella noted and stored in the careful catalog she was keeping of who he was. She wore the green wool riding coat she had finished in the days after Martin's first visit, paired with a skirt of deep ivory wool, because she was a woman who wore the things she made, and she was proud of both the coat and the occasion. She had embroidered small white flowers along the collar that took her 3 evenings and that nobody but Martin would probably notice, and when he saw her walking toward him down the short aisle of the church, his eyes went directly to the embroidery, and he smiled the slow, real smile that she had come to understand meant something had moved him genuinely, and she knew she had been right to put the flowers there. They exchanged the plain vows of the 1880s frontier church, the simple, powerful words that had been said in every state of weather and fortune by every kind of people, and they said them to each other looking directly at one another, clearly and without wavering. After the church, the town gathered in the open lot behind the livery, where Bernard Wick had somehow organized a proper celebration with tables and food contributed by half the households in the county, and there was music from 3 men with fiddles and a man with a battered concertina who had materialized from the direction of the saloon. The Garza family was there, Francisco on a crutch and Maria in her best dress, and Rodrigo Salinas and Pete were there, and Mabel Dawson was there looking both disapproving and deeply moved, which was the most honest expression Ella had ever seen on her face, and the whole afternoon went forward in the warm May light with the quality of a thing that was right, genuinely and completely right, in the way that few things in life manage to be. Martin danced with her once in the clear space between the tables, a waltz that he danced without particular skill but with absolute sincerity, one hand at her waist and one hand holding hers, keeping time with the fiddles with the kind of determination he applied to everything, and she put her face close to his and said, "You can't waltz at all, can you?" "Not even slightly," he agreed. "Good," she said. "Neither can I. We'll be equal about it." They laughed together in the middle of the May afternoon, dancing badly and entirely happily, And that was how they began. The first year on the Crawford Ranch was a year of work and discovery, of the slow, satisfying labor of building a life from the raw materials of land and will. Martin finished the roof through the summer, spending long hot days up there with Rodrigo and Pete, replacing boards and laying new shingles, and Ella painted the interior of the house herself, choosing colors with the same deliberate care she brought to fabric selection, a warm cream for the walls and a clean white for the trim, and a particular dusty blue for the kitchen that she mixed herself from the pigments available at the general store. She kept the shop, as they had agreed. She hired a girl named Clara Reeves, 17 and quick with a needle, to help during the busy season, and Clara turned out to be genuinely talented in a way that made Ella both proud and competitive, which was exactly the kind of assistant she had wanted without knowing she had wanted it. She rode into town 3 days a week on the brown mare she had purchased with the first good quarter of the shop's annual profit, a horse she named Sunday for no reason she could articulate, and she managed the business with the same efficiency she always had, but there was a new ease to it now, the ease of a woman who has something to come home to. She came home to Martin. He was not always easy. He had a stubbornness about certain things, a quality of having decided something that made it very difficult to reconsider. And there were evenings when they sat on opposite sides of a disagreement, and neither of them gave ground readily. And the voices in the kitchen sometimes rose above polite conversation before they settled back to something workable. But he argued the way he did everything, directly and without cruelty, and he had a capacity to hear her that she had not encountered before in a man, to actually revise his position when she showed him something he had not considered, and she had the same capacity toward him, and together they built something from their disagreements as well as from their agreements. The well was properly repaired in August by a man from Midland who knew his business and charged accordingly, but left behind a well that could be counted on, which was not a small thing in a Texas summer. Martin began building a second barn in September, planning ahead for the cattle he intended to introduce in the spring, and Ella helped him lay out the foundation measurements, because she had a precise eye for line and angle that proved useful in ways neither of them had expected. Maria Garza taught Ella to make proper flour tortillas during an October afternoon visit, and Ella taught Maria to mend the particularly difficult seam on a leather vest that Francisco Garza wore despite its disintegrating condition, and the two women developed a friendship of the practical, warm, genuine kind that is built from shared skills and shared meals, and the kind of regard that comes from seeing a person clearly. Francisco Garza's leg healed badly, with a slight permanent lean to his gait, but he was on both feet by September and working, and he brought Martin 3 young hens in October as a gesture of thanks for the summer's help, which Martin accepted with the seriousness with which Garza offered them, and the hens joined the modest flock that Ella had been establishing behind the barn. The Tilby situation resolved itself in a more complete way than Martin had expected. Tilby, who had been quietly encroaching on small homesteads throughout the county for several years, came under the attention of the county land office in the fall when a collective complaint was brought by 4 homesteaders, the Garzas among them, documenting the various intrusions. Martin gave a written statement about the fence line matter and served as a witness when required, and by November Tilby had been formally ordered to vacate 3 parcels of disputed land and had lost a water rights claim he had held since 1878. The justice was not dramatic. It was paperwork and testimony and the grinding process of frontier law, which was imperfect and slow, but which sometimes, against expectation, arrived at the right place. The small homesteaders around Harrow Creek got their water access and their property lines back, and Tilby sold 2 of his properties and moved to Abilene, and nobody who remained was particularly sorry to see him go. By the first winter, Ella and Martin had settled into each other with the depth and comfort of two people who have chosen well and know it. The evenings were long and cold, the north wind coming down off the plain with nothing to break it for 50 miles, and they sat by the fireplace in the room she had painted cream and blue and read to each other, which was something they had discovered almost accidentally, that reading aloud was better than reading alone when the book was good, and they took turns with it, novel by novel, and argued about the books the way they argued about everything, with heat and honesty and the pleasure of a well-matched opponent. He read to her from a battered copy of Charles Dickens that had been in his uncle's possession since before Martin was born, and she read to him from the Washington Irving volume she had found at the library trade shelf, and they got through 3 novels between November and March, and the winter did not feel long. She found out she was expecting their first child in the February of 1883, which was 9 months after their wedding, which was entirely within the realm of normal, and she told Martin on a Tuesday evening while they were doing the supper dishes, because she was not a woman who made theater of things, and the kitchen was where they had some of their best conversations. He went very still. He set down the dish he was drying and turned to look at her, and his face did the thing it did when something had moved him, the jaw working and the eyes going very serious, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her carefully as though she had become fragile, which she immediately corrected. "I'm not breakable," she said into his collar. "I know," he said, but he held on. She let him. The spring of 1883 brought the new cattle, 12 head of good mixed stock that Martin purchased from a ranch near Fredericksburg, and drove north himself with Rodrigo. A 3-day trip that Ella spent in her usual efficient way, splitting her time between the shop and the ranch, with the additional project of replacing the curtains in the 2 bedrooms with heavier ones against the coming summer heat. She was 4 months along when the cattle arrived, and she stood at the fence and watched Martin bring them in with the particular satisfaction of a woman who is watching something she helped plan come to fruition. The ranch was alive now in a way that it had not been when she first rode out to see it. The new barn stood solid and square. The fence lines were straight and properly staked. The garden behind the house, properly tended now under Maria Garza's instructional influence, had gone through its winter planting and was coming into its spring green with purpose. The live oaks had leafed out fully, making a cathedral of shade along the creek bank, and the house under its repaired roof looked settled and permanent, looked like a place that had been here a long time and intended to be here a long time more. In July, Clara Reeves married a young schoolteacher who arrived in Harrow Creek with his appointment from the county school board and fell comprehensively in love with her within a month of meeting her. And Ella sewed Clara's wedding dress, which was the most elaborate thing she had made since her own riding coat, and which Clara cried over in the fitting and which looked, on the day, exactly as it ought to. Ella gave her 2 days off for the wedding and a week for the honeymoon, and took on a new assistant, a widow named Agnes Booth, who had been making ends meet by taking in laundry, and who turned out to have a quiet, focused talent for the finer work. Martin went into town with Ella less frequently as the summer deepened, because the ranch demanded more of him, and he had hired a third hand, a young man named Samuel who had come up from the Pecos country, and who reminded Martin of himself at 23, a comparison that he did not make aloud but that shaped how he treated Samuel, with the directness and respect that he himself had wanted at that age and not always received. Ella rode out to the ranch more often. By August, with the baby coming in October, she had shifted her schedule to spend 4 days at the ranch and 3 in town, and the arrangement suited the season and the circumstance, and Agnes proved capable of managing the shop's daily operations with minimal oversight, which was the best thing Ella could have discovered at that particular time. The baby came in late October, which was earlier than they had anticipated, though not dangerously so, arriving on a Tuesday night with a force of wind and rain that made the lantern in the bedroom flicker, and the oaks outside knocked their branches against the siding. Maria Garza was there, having ridden over when Ella sent word that things were beginning, and she was calm and competent and spoke to Ella in a mixture of Spanish and English that was both practical and comforting. And Martin was in the kitchen with his hands pressed flat on the table, listening, which was the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. The baby was a boy. He was solid and loud and entirely healthy, and Martin held him for the first time sitting on the edge of the bed next to Ella, who was tired in a profound way that was nevertheless luminous with something larger than fatigue. And the rain was still going outside and the lantern was steady now, and Martin looked down at the boy in his arms with an expression that Ella would remember for the rest of her life. "Well," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Well," she agreed. "He's real," Martin said. "Very real," Ella said. "He has opinions about it. You heard them from the kitchen." Martin laughed, a short, real laugh, and the baby objected to the vibration. And Ella reached over and touched the baby's cheek with one finger, and Martin's arm tightened slightly around both of them, the three of them together in the lamplit room while the storm finished its business outside. They named him James, for Martin's father whose middle name it was, and for Reverend Alcott who had married them. And James Crawford came into the world with a set of lungs and a direct gaze that suggested he had inherited opinions from both sides of the family. The letter Ella wrote to her mother after James arrived was the longest she had written in years. She described everything, the ranch and the weather and the birth and the baby, and she described Martin at the kitchen table listening through the wall, because she thought her mother should know that. She sealed it and mailed it from town on her first trip back in November, and when the reply came 3 weeks later, her mother had written 3 full pages and had wept visibly while writing the last of them, which Ella could tell from the way the ink had run. And the letter said, among other things, that the cousin's son from Galveston had married a banker's daughter in September and was doing very well for himself. And Ella read that part twice, and then set the letter down and looked out the shop window at the November sky and felt entirely at peace with every choice she had ever made. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a full one. James was a demanding, curious, sociable baby, the kind who wanted to be held and talked to and shown things, and who grew visibly from week to week in a way that both delighted and slightly alarmed his parents, as though he had somewhere to be and was in a hurry about it. He passed through the milestones with an enthusiasm that made Martin shake his head and Ella compile mental notes that she later realized she was writing down in the back of her ledger. Small observations about what James did and when, a habit she recognized as the same one that kept her business running, the tendency to notice and record what mattered. The shop had its best January on record, because Ella had taken on an order for 6 riding coats from the wives of a ranching syndicate based outside of San Angelo, a commission that came through the recommendation of one of her earliest loyal customers, and the work was substantial and well-paying, and she and Agnes worked through the early winter mornings at the big work table while James slept in the basket she brought to the shop when she came in on her 3-town days. And the riding coats went out in February, and the letters of appreciation came back in March, and 2 more orders followed. Martin expanded the herd in the spring of 1884, adding 15 more head, and he made an arrangement with a cattle buyer out of San Antonio that gave the Crawford Ranch a reliable market for its beef, which was the crucial step from subsistence operation to genuine working ranch. And he came home from the signing of that agreement with a quality in his face that Ella recognized as the particular satisfaction of a thing built from nothing into something real. They celebrated that evening with a bottle of good wine that Ella had ordered from the dry goods store for occasions, and which had been waiting in the kitchen cabinet since November. Martin was not a drinking man in the way of the saloon. He went to the saloon perhaps once a month for the social company and the news, and he nursed a single beer through the whole of it. But wine with Ella in their own kitchen was something different, something that belonged to the texture of their life together. They sat on the porch afterward in the spring evening, late enough that James was down and asleep in the house, and the sky was doing something magnificent above the Texas plain, going from red to purple to the deep indigo that preceded the stars, and the sound of the cattle in the near pasture was a low, steady presence at the edge of the evening. "I want to tell you something," Martin said. She looked at him. "I want to tell you that I knew," he said. "When I asked you, I knew it wasn't just the buttons." "I know," she said. "I want to say it anyway." He looked at her in the thickening dark. "You were the most real person I had seen in a long time, before I even knew your name. The way you looked at the buttons and told me what needed doing without making it more complicated than it was. It sounds like a small thing." "It doesn't sound small," she said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." He was quiet. "I was not going to say anything that evening. I was going to pay you and leave. And then I was standing there and the month was wrong and I had been in town 2 days. And I asked you anyway because the alternative was walking out and spending the rest of my life wondering what I had walked away from." Ella looked at the darkening sky for a moment. "The alternative," she said, "was that nobody ever asked." He turned to look at her. "What?" She told him then the full version, the Mabel Dawson confrontation in the general store and the words she had said, and the men who had considered and retreated and the growing embarrassment of an invitation that nobody accepted. And she told it lightly, with the humor that distance had given it. But underneath the lightness he could hear the part that had not been light, the real loneliness of those weeks. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "Frank Holloway stood outside your window for 15 minutes. "Did he?" she said. "I heard about it at the saloon. He told it as a funny story." Martin was quiet. "It wasn't funny." "No," she agreed, "but it turned out fine." "It turned out better than fine," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his, which was her turn this time, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat on the porch of the ranch they had built together with the stars beginning to appear overhead and the cattle quiet in the pasture and their son sleeping in the house behind them, and it was the kind of moment that has no drama in it and no need of any. "Thank you," she said, quietly. "For what?" "For being the one who asked." He was quiet for a long time, holding her hand in the dark. "Thank you for saying yes before I could lose my nerve." "You were not going to lose your nerve." "No," he admitted, "I wasn't." She laughed, and he squeezed her hand, and the stars came the rest of the way out over the Texas plain. The years that followed were the years of a life built steadily and with intention, and they had both the smoothness and the roughness that real life carries with it in equal measure. In the spring of 1885, the shop on Morrow Street expanded into the adjacent space when the boot repair man next door retired to Galveston to live with his daughter, and Ella took the lease and knocked through the wall with Martin's help and built herself a proper fitting room and a second work table. And Harrow Creek alterations and fine sewing became, in the assessment of the county ladies who traveled for it, the finest garment establishment between Abilene and San Antonio. Agnes Booth became her full partner in all but name by that summer, with a wage that reflected the actual value of her contribution, which was Ella's business, paying people what they were worth. Martin completed the second barn that autumn and hired Samuel on permanently, and Samuel brought with him a younger brother named Cal, who was 19 and slight, and turned out to be the best horseman Martin had ever employed, with a quality of attention toward animals that the horses themselves seemed to recognize. Cal stayed on for years and became as much a fixture of the Crawford ranch as the live oaks along the creek. James walked at 10 months and talked at 14, and was reading simple words at 3, which did not surprise his mother in the slightest, and which filled Martin with a quality of pride he managed by building James a small wooden horse for his 2nd birthday that took him 3 weeks to complete, and which James regarded with the critical eye of a child who has been taught to notice workmanship. In the late summer of 1886, Ella found herself expecting again. This was expected in the general sense and still managed to feel specific and new in the way these things do, and she told Martin this time at the porch in the evening rather than in the kitchen, which was the only real difference from the first time, and he went through the same process of going still, and then careful, and then holding on that he had the first time, and she let him again because some things did not need to be improved. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1887 on a clear, warm morning that was entirely unlike James's stormy October arrival, arriving with a calm efficiency that Ella remarked on while Maria Garza laughed and Martin waited in the kitchen, and James, who was 3 3/4 and fully informed of the situation, waited beside his father with an expression of serious importance. They named her Ruth, for Martin's mother in Austin, and the letter Martin wrote to Austin that evening was the longest letter he had ever written in his life. His mother wrote back with such warmth and joy that the pages were slightly crinkled by the time they arrived, as though they had passed through weather. Ruth was her mother's daughter in certain ways, notably in the directness of her gaze and in the way she considered things before reacting, but she had her father's steady temperament and his particular quality of noticing small things, and she was from her earliest months a person who seemed to know what she was about. The family traveled to Austin in the fall of 1887, all 4 of them, on the train from Abilene, which was the first train James had ever ridden, an event of such magnitude in his 3.5-year-old life that he narrated it continuously for the duration of the journey in a way that made the other passengers smile. Martin's mother, Ruth Sr., was a small, white-haired woman with strong hands and direct eyes that were the same Autumn Creek color as her son's, and she held baby Ruth with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised 3 boys on difficult land, and she looked at Ella with the appraisal of a woman who knows the kind of person it takes to keep her kind of son, and what she saw in Ella satisfied her completely. "You're nothing like what I was afraid you'd be," Ruth Sr. said on the second evening when Martin had taken James out to the yard to look at something and Ruth the baby was sleeping in the back room. Ella looked at her. "What were you afraid of?" "Oh, various things." Martin's mother smiled. "A woman who married quickly. You hear those stories and they go certain ways, but he wrote to me about you from the beginning and you could tell from the letters, the things he wrote about you." "What did he write?" Ella asked because she was a direct woman and the question was natural. Ruth Sr. considered. "He wrote that you were the most honest person he had met in years. He wrote that you were not pretending to be anything. He wrote that he asked you to supper and you said yes without performing about it, and that you ate your supper and talked about real things, and that when he walked you home and said he'd ask you again, you said come back in a month and meant it." She paused. "He wrote that he walked back to the hotel and thought that he had not felt that kind of certainty about anything since the first time he decided he wanted his own land." Ella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He never told me he wrote those things." "Men rarely do," his mother said without rancor, "but they feel them." Ella looked at the doorway through which Martin had gone, and she thought about the months she had asked for, and all the months after it, and the living they had built in those months, and she felt something that was too large and too specific for a single word, the kind of thing you carry in your chest like a steady warmth that you have stopped noticing because it is always there, which is not because it has become small but because it has become part of the air. They came home from Austin on a Friday, all 4 of them, and Martin drove them from Abilene in the wagon under a sky the color of pewter with a low, cold front pushing in from the north, and James fell asleep against Ella's side before they reached the Crawford property line, and Ruth slept in her basket secured between the seat and the wagon bed, and Martin drove with one hand on the reins and one arm around Ella's shoulders because the cold was serious, and she leaned against him, while the horses found the way home that they knew without being guided. She looked at the house as they came up the lane, the cream and blue and white of it showing warm lantern light in the kitchen window where Samuel had lit the lamp before leaving for the bunkhouse, and the live oaks dark and settled against the gray sky, and the barn solid behind them, and she thought that she had been right 2 years ago when she stood here for the first time and saw it as it would be rather than as it was. It had become what it was going to be, exactly as she had seen it. The years between 1887 and 1890 were the years of the ranch reaching its full working capacity, of the children growing in the fast, consuming way of young children, of Ella's shop becoming sufficiently established that she reduced her personal hours without reducing its output, and of Martin and Ella themselves moving deeper into the particular country of a long and genuine marriage, where the landscape becomes familiar but continues to surprise you, where you know the other person well enough to see them clearly and still find that clarity interesting. Harrow Creek itself changed in those years. The railroad spur came through in 1888, connecting the town to the main line at Abilene, and this changed the character of the place, as railroads always change the character of small frontier towns, bringing new commerce and new people and new problems and new possibilities, leveling out some of the isolation that had defined the place and replacing it with something more connected, but also more complicated. The open country around the town filled in more quickly after the railroad, with new homesteaders and new ranches, and the particular wildness that had been the quality of the place when Ella arrived was softened, not gone but different. Martin tracked these changes with the interested attention of a man who understood that land was never static, that what you owned was always being shaped by what happened around it, and he made careful decisions about the Crawford Ranch in those years that were about the long horizon rather than the immediate season, investing in fencing and water development, and the quality of his breeding stock in ways that paid back not immediately but over time, and the time proved him right. The letter from Ella's mother arrived in the summer of 1889 with the information that her mother was not well, that a persistent cough had become something the doctor in Galveston was taking seriously, and Ella read this letter standing in the kitchen and stood there for a moment with the letter in her hand and the familiar feeling of a world showing you its edges. She went to Galveston on the train, taking Ruth with her because the baby, who was 2.5 and not really a baby anymore, could not yet be left for the necessary duration, and leaving James in Martin's care, which was to say in the care of both Martin and Rodrigo and Samuel and Cal and Agnes Booth, who took 1 day a week at the ranch to bring James fresh baked goods and ensure that the males of the household were managing the basics. Galveston in the summer of 1889 was the same salt, bright, humid, bustling port that Ella had grown up in and left, and being back in it with Ruth on her hip was a strange layering of past and present, of the girl she had been, and the woman she had become, and the child she had made, all three existing in the same space at once. Her mother was thin and tired, but not as bad as the letter had suggested, or perhaps the letter had been calibrated to bring Ella quickly, which she understood, and which she could not quite be angry about. She stayed for 3 weeks and helped her mother with the things that needed doing and took her to the doctor and sat with her in the evenings on the porch that faced the Gulf, the same porch where they had sat every summer evening of Ella's childhood, and they talked in the way that mothers and daughters talk when distance and time have softened some things and sharpened others. Her mother said on the 2nd week, "Tell me about him." "I have told you about him," Ella said, "in many letters." "Tell me as though you are telling me now," her mother said. "Not what you wrote in a letter, just tell me." So Ella sat in the Gulf evening and told her mother about Martin Crawford, about the buttons that had started it, and the supper that had followed, and the month she had asked for, and the way he had asked on the street in front of the post office with no theater and no pretense, and about the year of building and the evening when the baby was coming, and he sat in the kitchen with his hands flat on the table, and about the porch conversations and the books they read aloud, and the arguments that were always honest, and the way he held his children, James first, and then Ruth, with a careful reverence that he allowed himself because nobody was watching. Her mother listened to all of it without interrupting, which was a form of generosity she had become better at as she got older. When Ella finished, her mother said, "I am glad you said it out loud in the store that day." Ella looked at her. "You heard about that. Your aunt wrote to me she thought I would be mortified." Her mother smiled. "I thought it was brave. I thought it was necessary," Ella said. "I had run out of patience with waiting for something that wasn't coming. And then it came." "And then it came," Ella agreed, 2 days later for Buttons. Her mother laughed, a genuine laugh that ended in coughing, but the laugh was real, and Ella took her mother's hand and held it, and they sat together in the Gulf's salt air as the sun went down in orange and rose over the water, and Ella stored the image carefully in the catalog she kept of things she intended to keep. She came home to Harrow Creek in early August, on the train to Abilene and the wagon home, and Martin was waiting at the Abilene depot with James, who had grown visibly in 3 weeks, and who talked for 40 minutes without stopping about what had happened at the ranch in her absence, including a coyote that had come close to the chicken coop and been repelled by Cal with a broom, and a hailstorm that had broken one of the kitchen window panes, and a letter that had arrived from Austin with drawings from Cousin Margaret, who was James's age, and a new foal that had been born to the bay mare on the 2nd day of Ella's absence and who was, James reported with the authority of clothes observation, the best horse he had ever seen. Martin loaded her trunk onto the wagon and helped Ruth settle on the wagon seat and waited until James had talked himself into a temporary pause, and then he looked at Ella over the top of James's head with a look that was quiet and complete, the look of a man who has had someone away and is simply glad they are back, and she returned it with the same completeness, and they did not need to say anything more than that. "Your mother?" he asked, starting the horses. "Stable for now," she said. "She's thinner, but she's herself. I'll go again before winter if it seems necessary." He nodded. "Whatever you need." She leaned against him on the wagon seat the way she always did on the long drives, and the Texas summer evening came down warm and enormous all around them, and James fell asleep between them before they reached the county line, and Ruth was asleep in her basket, and Martin drove in the companionable silence that they had made between them over the years, the silence of two people who know each other well enough to not require words to prove they are present. The decade turned. 1890 came to Harrow Creek with a cold January and a wet spring, and the ranch went through a difficult season when a cattle disease moved through the county and took 3 of Martin's animals before the county veterinarian got ahead of it, and it was the kind of year that tested a working ranch's reserves and found them either adequate or not. They were adequate. Because Martin had been careful, because Ella had insisted on maintaining reserves that he might have reinvested without her counsel, because the shop's income had, in the years when the ranch ran lean, provided a floor that kept the house standing. And he knew it, and he told her so plainly, which was the kind of thing that mattered more than it sounded. "The shop has kept us sound this year," he said in the spring of 1890, going over the accounts at the kitchen table. "I want you to know I see that." She looked at him. "The ranch will have better years." "It will," he agreed, "and you will still have saved us this one." She accepted this without false modesty, because she had worked for it and it was true, and the acknowledgement was honest. And between honest people that was how it was supposed to work. Ella's mother died in the autumn of 1891, in Galveston, peacefully and in her own house, which was what she had wanted. Ella had gone down in September when the letters made it clear that the time was near, and she was there when it happened, which was a grace she was grateful for. She stayed to settle the affairs and came home in October, quieter than usual for several weeks, carrying the particular weight of a world that has rearranged itself around an absence. Martin was careful with her in those weeks in the way he was careful about things that mattered, which was not to say delicate or evasive, but present. He did not try to fill the silence or rush the grief. He simply continued to be entirely himself, which was the best thing anyone could have done, because the consistency of him was what she returned to when the grief moved through her and left, as grief does, the changed landscape of after. James was 8 by then and going to school in town, and he was the kind of boy who took school seriously without losing any of the sharpness that made him interesting, the combination that a good teacher could work with. and his teacher in Harrow Creek, a competent woman named Miss Frances Reed who had come from back east, understood what she had in him and challenged him accordingly. He was reading well above his grade by the time he was 9, which pleased Ella, and he had begun helping Martin with the smaller ranch tasks with a seriousness that pleased Martin, and he was the kind of child who belonged entirely to both of them without being a copy of either. Ruth at 4 was her own person in ways that became clearer as she grew, a girl with strong preferences about everything from the color of her dress to the route she walked to the Garza house, where Maria had become as much an aunt to both children as any blood relation. Ruth was precise and observant, and had inherited her mother's needle sense, showing interest in the shop from the time she was old enough to sit on the tall stool at the work table and be shown the basics of a running stitch. In the summer of 1892, Rodrigo Salinas, who had been with the Crawford ranch from the first week of fencing, and who had become as much a part of the place as the barn or the well, married a woman named Consuela from a family south of town, in a ceremony that the entire Crawford household attended, and Martin was best man, which was not a common arrangement between an Anglo ranch owner and his Mexican cowhand in Texas in 1892, and which Martin did without considering what it looked like to anyone else, because it was the right thing, and the right thing was not complicated if you were willing to be clear-eyed about it. Ella made Consuela's wedding dress, which was white with fine embroidery at the collar and cuffs, the best work she had done since her own riding coat, and Consuela wore it beautifully, and Rodrigo looked at his bride with an expression that Ella recognized from the inside, the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck in the best possible way. The 1890s brought more changes to Harrow Creek and to the wider country. The frontier was closing, not all at once, but perceptibly, the open range giving way to the fenced and filed and registered, the wildness being measured and sorted and parceled. Martin watched this with a clear eye and made his adaptations, because the same qualities that had made him good on the open cattle trails made him good at the business of a working ranch in a changing landscape, the willingness to look at what was real rather than what he wished were real. He began raising horses in addition to cattle in 1893, buying a quality breeding mare from a ranch outside of Fredericksburg, and starting a program that Cal, whose natural gift with horses had only deepened with the years, managed with the kind of quiet expertise that did not require supervision. The Crawford horses acquired a reputation in the county for soundness and good temper, and the market for them was steady and growing. The shop on Morrow Street had by 1894 become something that Ella was considering in terms of its future rather than its present, because the future was James, who at 11 was showing no particular interest in sewing, and Ruth, who was 7 and very interested in sewing but also in every other thing that existed in the world, and Agnes Booth, who had been her partner in all but name for nearly a decade and who deserved, Ella had decided, actual partnership. She made Agnes a formal partner in the spring of 1894. She drew up the papers with the county lawyer, a careful man named Hendricks who had learned to take Ella Whitaker Crawford seriously, and she gave Agnes a 30% share of the business in exchange for Agnes's agreement to continue managing the daily operations, and the arrangement was fair in the specific, accountable way that all of Ella's arrangements were fair. Agnes wept briefly and then composed herself and made practical suggestions about the new partnership structure, which was so exactly the response Ella had hoped for that she had to hide her own smile while she was writing it down. Martin's mother, Ruth Sr., made her last trip from Austin to the ranch in the summer of 1895, at 72, moving more slowly than she once had but with the same direct eyes and the same strong hands, and she spent 3 weeks with them, sleeping in the room that Ella had furnished over the years with the quiet care of a woman who understood that the details of a guest room are a form of love. She sat on the porch in the evenings with her grandchildren, James at 12 and Ruth at 8, and she told them things about their father's childhood with a cheerful accuracy that Martin bore, with the patience of a man who knows that grandparents have rights. She died in Austin the following February, in her sleep, in her own room at peace, and Martin received the letter from his brother on a Monday morning, and read it at the kitchen table, and sat with it for a while before he told Ella, who was standing at the stove with her back to him. And when he told her, she turned around and came to where he was sitting and put her arms around him from behind and held on, and he put his hands over hers, and they stayed like that for a while in the morning kitchen. She was a good woman, Ella said. The best kind, he agreed. His voice was steady. He was her son. He cried that night quietly in the dark, thinking she was asleep. She was not asleep. She did not say anything. She moved closer to him in the dark and put her hand over his heart, and he covered her hand with his, and they lay like that until he steadied, and neither of them spoke of it in the morning, because it was his to carry in the way he needed to carry it, and she had given him what she could without requiring him to make it more public than it was. These were the years of a life, all the texture of them, the good and the hard and the ordinary and the extraordinary, the ranch and the shop and the children and the friends and the losses, and the seasons cycling through in the way seasons do. And through all of it the particular fact of Martin and Ella, the central gravitational fact of two people who had chosen each other clearly and continued to choose each other with the same clarity in every year after. James turned 16 in 1899, in the final year of the century, and was a tall, serious young man with his father's build and his mother's gray eyes, and a mind that had outgrown the Harrow Creek schoolhouse 3 years ago, and that both of his parents had been thinking about carefully. He wanted to study law. He had been reading about it since he was 12, borrowing everything the courthouse library had on the subject, and writing away for pamphlets from the State University in Austin. They sent him to Austin in the fall of 1899, which was the most difficult thing Ella had done since her mother's death, and the most obvious right decision, because James was built for exactly what he was going toward, and she had raised him to go toward what he was built for without requiring him to be less because of where he started. Martin drove him to the Abilene station himself. They stood on the platform before the train came in, father and son, not much shorter than each other anymore. And Martin said what he needed to say in the direct way he said everything, and James listened with his father's own quality of complete attention, and they shook hands on the platform, and then Martin pulled him in briefly and James let him. And then the train came and James got on it, and Martin stood and watched it go with his hat in his hand, and came home and found something to do in the barn for an hour. Ruth, who was 12, was not going to make it easy for anyone to forget that the house was quieter now, and she filled the quiet in her own energetic way, having entered the age of strong opinions about everything from ranch management to the literature curriculum at the Harrow Creek school, where her teacher, a successive teacher to Miss Reed who had married and moved to Abilene, found Ruth both his most challenging and most rewarding student. She was sewing seriously by now, spending 2 days a week at the shop with Agnes, learning the business end of it as much as the craft end, because Ella had decided early that what she was teaching Ruth was not just how to sew, but how to own something, how to build and hold and make decisions about a thing that was yours. The new century arrived quietly in Harrow Creek, marked by a modest gathering in the church hall and a firework that someone had obtained from a merchant in Abilene, and that performed adequately in the cold January night air before expiring into sparks. And Martin and Ella stood outside in the new year and looked at the stars they had been looking at together for 18 years now, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the stars were the same stars they had always been. 18 years, he said. Nearly, she said. The anniversary is in May. It feels longer, he said, and then before she could interpret that, in the way that means it would not make sense for it to have been otherwise, not that it has been too long, she looked up at him. I know what you meant. You always do, he said. Always, she agreed. He kissed her in the cold January of 1900, on the porch of the house they had built together, under the stars over the Texas plain. And it was the kind of kiss that contains everything behind it and everything in front of it at once. The ease of long knowledge and the warmth that does not diminish with familiarity when the foundation is real. James came home from Austin in the summer with a letter of acceptance to the University of Texas School of Law, which was not officially a law school yet, but was the closest thing in the state, and which represented exactly the direction he had been going. He came home brown from the Austin sun and 3 inches taller in his bearing if not in actual height, and he sat on the Crawford porch and talked about what he had been studying and what he intended. And Martin listened to him, the way Martin listened to everything important completely. And Ella watched the two of them talking and felt the specific joy of seeing your child become the person you hoped they would become. Ruth was 14 in 1901, and she had begun working at the shop as a genuine contributing presence rather than a learning one. And she had developed a specialty in the embroidery work that Ella had always done herself, surpassing her mother in the fineness of it within a year and a half, which Ella announced in the shop one afternoon with exactly the pride she felt, and none of the competitive diminishment that might have been expected. "She's better than I am at this," Ella said to Agnes, holding up a piece of Ruth's embroidery next to her own equivalent work. Agnes studied both pieces. "Yes," she said, which was the honest answer. "Good," Ella said, and meant it. The ranch in 1902 was a fully mature operation, 15 years from the leaning well and the broken fence line. A working cattle and horse ranch of 320 acres, with a reputation for quality that reached well beyond Harrow Creek, where it had started. Martin had built it into something that could sustain itself and grow, and he managed it now with the confidence of a man who knows his ground completely. Rodrigo Salinas, who had been with them from the beginning, had his own small place now, 2 miles east, purchased with a decade and a half of careful saving, and he ran his own cattle on it while still working a few days a week at the Crawford Ranch. And Martin had extended him credit at the necessary moment with terms that were generous and clearly stated, because that was how you treated a man who had helped you build something from nothing. The summer of 1903 brought a drought, the kind that made the creek run low and the pastures brown early, and Martin managed it with the same practical directness he brought to everything, reducing the herd before the feed situation became critical, hauling water, making decisions that cost in the short term and preserved in the long term. It was a hard summer but not a ruinous one, and by fall the rains returned and the creek came back, and the grass recovered in the gradual, patient way of Texas grass. James finished his studies in the fall of 1903 and came back to Texas, not to Harrow Creek directly but to San Antonio, where he joined a law practice as a junior associate, because San Antonio in 1903 was a place where a young lawyer with his qualities could build something, and he had inherited enough of both his parents' natures to understand what building something required. He came home for Christmas of that year, 20 years old and precise and warm and entirely himself, and he brought with him a letter of introduction that turned out to be a young woman named Helen from an Austin family, which was not the young woman herself but the possibility of her, and he spoke about her with the careful understatement of a young man who is very certain and does not yet want to say so out loud. Ella listened to the understatement and understood it completely and said nothing, except that she hoped he would bring Helen to Harrow Creek when the occasion was right. And the occasion was the following summer, and Helen turned out to be the right kind of woman for James in exactly the ways that Ella had hoped for without allowing herself to articulate. A clear-eyed, direct, well-read woman who looked at James the way you look at someone you intend to spend your time with, and who asked Martin about the ranch with a genuine interest that was not performed. Martin liked her immediately, which he expressed by showing her the horses, because horses were what he showed people he wanted to understand him. Ella and Ruth stood at the fence while Martin and James took Helen to meet the breeding mare, who was this generation's descendant of the original Fredericksburg Purchase, and Ruth said, "James has good taste. He comes by it naturally," Ella said. Ruth looked at her mother sideways. That was very self-satisfied. "Was it?" Ella said. "Yes, it probably was." Ruth laughed, and Ella laughed with her in the summer afternoon at the fence of the Crawford ranch. James and Helen married in San Antonio in the spring of 1905, in a ceremony that Martin and Ella attended on the train from Abilene. And Ruth was a bridesmaid in a dress she had made herself. And Ella sat in the church and watched her son say the plain, powerful words at the altar with Helen's hands in his. And she thought about a Tuesday morning in the general store and Mabel Dawson, and the words that had come out without planning, and the man who had walked in 2 days later for buttons. And she thought that every consequence of a single honest moment was standing in this church in San Antonio, and she reached over and took Martin's hand, and he held it through the rest of the ceremony, without letting go. Ruth, who was 18 in the spring of 1905, had by then outgrown Harrow Creek in certain ways and was planning for Austin, where Ella had been in correspondence with a dressmaking establishment of excellent reputation, whose owner was willing to take Ruth on as an apprentice with the understanding that she was arriving with considerable skill already and would be treated accordingly. The arrangement was Ella's doing, the negotiation conducted through 2 years of careful letters, the kind of patient, precise campaign she had always conducted when something mattered. Ruth left for Austin in September of 1905, on the same train line that James had taken 6 years before, and the house on the Crawford ranch was quiet in a different way after that, the full quiet of 2 people who have raised their family and sent it into the world and are now returned to the original shape of things, 2 people who began alone and who are alone again, but differently. It was not lonely. That was the thing Ella had wondered about in the weeks before Ruth left, whether the quiet would feel like loss, and it did not, or not only. It felt also like space, the particular spaciousness of 2 people who know each other completely and do not need the mediation of children between them, who can exist in a room together without talk and in talk without performance, who have built something so real and so interlocking that it holds its shape regardless of who is in it on any given day. The evenings returned to what they had been in the beginning, supper together and conversation, and the books read aloud, though the books were different now, older and longer and more demanding, because 23 years of reading had taken both of them further, and the arguments about the books were better than they had ever been, sharper and more pleasurable, because 2 people who have argued well together for long enough develop a kind of conversational fluency that is its own form of intimacy. Martin was 50 years old in 1905, and he looked it and he did not mind. The ranch had put the good kind of marks on him, the outdoors and the work and the seasons, and he was lean and straight and substantially what he had been at 30, only with 20 years of specific knowledge behind the eyes. He rode every morning, which he had done since before Ella knew him, and he had no intention of stopping. Ella was 47, and she was, by her own reckoning, more interesting than she had been at 24, which was the measure she applied rather than any comparison to an external standard. She still went into town twice a week to consult with Agnes on the business, though consult was perhaps an overstatement, since Agnes ran the shop with total competence, and the consultations were as much for the pleasure of the conversation as for any practical necessity. The shop was the most successful business on Morrow Street, and it had been for a decade. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in May of 1907, in the way they celebrated most things of significance, simply and with the people who mattered. Martin made supper, a skill he had developed gradually over the years, and that he applied with the same methodical directness he applied to everything. And it was better than it would have been in 1882 and not as good as Ella's best, which was how it had always been and which both of them found appropriate. Rodrigo and Consuela came, and Maria Garza, Francisco having passed several years ago in the natural way of things, and Agnes Booth, who had been Ella's partner for more than 20 years, and Cal, who was in his 40s now and still the best horseman in the county. They sat around the extended table in the Crawfords' kitchen, the same table at which Ella had first cooked supper for Martin 25 years ago, and they ate and drank and talked the way people talk who have been part of each other's lives long enough to speak without preamble. And the evening had the quality of all good things that have been carefully built, the solidity and the warmth of something that has lasted. After the guests left, Martin and Ella sat on the porch in the May night, which was the same porch and the same May stars as the evening 23 years ago when he had told her what he had thought when he walked into the shop, and she had told him about the announcement and the men who had not asked. 25 years, she said. Not bad for a man who came in for buttons, he said. She looked at him. The moon was high and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the live oaks moved softly in the spring air, and Martin Crawford looked back at her with the same Autumn Creek eyes she had first assessed across a dry goods counter, older and more themselves, everything that had been promised in them then delivered in full in the years since. It was the best announcement I ever made, she said. It was the best supper invitation I ever accepted, he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he took it back, and they sat in the spring night on the porch of the ranch they had built from a leaning well and a broken fence line into the truest place either of them had ever lived, and the stars came down over the Texas plain the way they always had, indifferent to human accomplishment and human love alike, but magnificent company regardless. What would you have done, she said, at some point in the quiet, if I had said no, on the street, when you asked? He considered this seriously because he was a man who gave serious questions serious treatment. I would have tried again, he said finally. Not immediately, not without cause. But I would not have stopped at no if you had meant maybe. What makes you think I meant maybe? Because you told me to ask again in a month, he said. A woman who means no does not set a date. She looked at the stars. I never meant no, she said, not even for a moment. I know, he said, I knew then too, and you asked anyway, she said, on the street with people watching. I didn't notice the people, he said. She smiled, looking at the stars. I know, she said. That was what convinced me. He squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, and the night went on around them, warm and starred and permanent in the way that all good things feel when they have become the ground you stand on rather than something you are still reaching for. James brought his wife Helen and their 2-year-old son, Thomas, to Harrow Creek at Christmas of 1907, and Thomas Crawford was the first of a generation that would grow up between Harrow Creek and San Antonio with grandparents on a ranch and parents in a city, and the full, wide inheritance of people who have been built by capable and loving hands. Ruth, in Austin, was establishing herself in the dressmaking world with the combination of her mother's business clarity and her own artistic refinement, and her letters home were full of the particular energy of a person who has found the right work and the right place at once, and who is building something in the way her parents had built things, from the ground up and on her own terms. Martin read Ruth's letters with a pride he expressed by reading the good parts aloud a second time without acknowledging he was doing it, and Ella let him, because she felt exactly the same. The ranch went on, through the seasons, through the years of the new century's first decade, through the gradual changes that came to all of West Texas as the frontier became history, and the history became the present. It was still the Crawford Ranch, and it was still run on the principles Martin had established from the beginning. The honest wage and the clear dealing and the fence line held exactly where it ought to be. Ella's shop, now officially the Booth and Crawford dressmaking establishment, was a permanent institution on Morrow Street, old enough that the next generation of Harrow Creek women came to it as a matter of course rather than as a new discovery. And Agnes Booth ran it with the confidence of long ownership, and Ella consulted on Tuesdays. And the arrangement was exactly what it had always been underneath its changing names. two competent women running a good business together. There were evenings when Martin and Ella sat on the porch of their house under the live oaks and could hear the town from 3 miles away if the wind was right. The sounds of Harrow Creek having grown and changed over 25 years into something substantially different from the place, Ella had made her announcement in the general store. But the ranch itself was its own country, the way all land eventually becomes its own country for the people who have truly worked it. And the sounds of the town were just weather to them, interesting but not intrusive, part of the world without being the whole of it. In the long spring evenings of 1908, they sat together often in the way they had always sat, with the conversation going where it went and the silence going where it went, and the whole of 26 years between them like a country they had walked across together and knew every part of. One evening in April, the same month they had met, Martin looked at her in the porch light, the long, low light of the Texas evening, and said, without preamble, "I would do it all exactly the same." She did not ask what he meant. She knew. "So would I," she said, "every day of it." He nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had known and wanted confirmed. He looked out at the live oaks, at the pasture beyond, at the country that had been his for 26 years and that he intended to be part of for every year he had remaining. "I was afraid, you know," he said. "When I asked," she looked at him. "You didn't seem it." "No," he said, "but I was, not of being refused, of being wrong about what I thought I saw, of walking back to that hotel and finding out I had imagined something that wasn't there." Ella thought about the buttons, about the precision of her own assessment in those 10 minutes, the reading of a person she had been doing all her life and never been more certain of. "You weren't wrong," she said. "No," he said. "I know that now." "You knew it then," she said. "That's why you asked." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that's why." The stars came out over the Texas plain in the April evening of 1908. The same stars that had been there in 1882 when a woman had stood at her shop door and watched a man walk toward the hotel and felt something in her chest that preceded hope. The same stars that had watched 26 years of supper and argument and laughter and grief and children and seasons, and all the accumulation of a real life built by two real people who had found each other by way of a general store announcement and a missing button. Ella looked at them and then at Martin, who was looking at her, and she thought that she had been right to say it out loud in the general store, that it had been the truest and most necessary thing she had ever said, and that the consequence of it had been this man and this life and this porch under these stars, and that she would stand in the general store and say it again without changing a single word. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He stood and she stood, and he held the door for her, and she went in, and the lamp in the kitchen came on and the warm light spilled out onto the porch boards, and the Texas night went on around the Crawford ranch the way it had always gone, wide and indifferent and full of stars. And inside the house that Ella had painted cream and dusty blue, two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other made coffee in the kitchen and talked in the easy, warm way of people who have found the right country and intend to stay there, all the way to the end of the road.